In today's episode of Locked On Pistons podcast, we are joined by Keith Smith to talk about the Detroit Pistons salary cap and all things CBA to break it down going into this offseason. Talk about today's episode, Locked On Pistons podcast. Let's go.
You are Locked On Pistons, your daily Detroit Pistons podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's the deal? Welcome back to another episode of the Locked On Pistons podcast. Per usual, I am your host, Koo Cahill. You can find me over on Twitter at Koo Cahill. I want to thank you guys for making Locked On Pistons your first listen of every single day. We are free and available on all your podcast platforms. If you haven't already, head to the YouTube channel at Locked On Pistons. Hit that subscribe button or leave us a 5-star review on whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on. That's another great way to support the podcast. Make sure you guys are checking out the description down below for the Substack and the playback. I'll have a Jay and Ivey season review coming in hopefully in the next few days over on the Substack. So if you haven't checked that out, make sure you guys are checking that out daily. I got content coming to you guys all the time. But we are lucky to be joined by Keith Smith, and you can find him on Twitter at Keith Smith MB, He does a lot of work for Spot Track. Keith, and he comes on every offseason. I think you guys have noticed that, and to help us out here. Keith, how you doing, man?
I'm doing well, man. I'm mostly excited to get to talk to you after a really fun season. We're not talking like a 18-win season and disappointment in the lottery and all that other stuff. So it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, this is definitely a different type of offseason we're discussing. Usually we're discussing how do the Pistons absorb some bad contracts? Are they going to trade some guys for some picks? Like, that's usually the discussion we're having. But we're in a different position here. The Pistons made the playoffs, took the Knicks as far as they could go, had a good series. And now it seems like they're in a much more positive direction. And even despite that, I do feel like there's a bit of confusion on what exactly they're going to do. What can they do this offseason? So let's go ahead and get into it. The first place I want to start with is where I see a lot of the conversations going around is whether the Pistons want to operate as a over-the-cap team or whether they want to create cap space. I've tried to explain it a little bit to my listeners, but obviously I'm not as, invested in it as you are. So if you want to go ahead and explain to the audience why the Pistons could operate as an over-the-cap team, what that means, and what's the benefit to both sides of which way they want to go.
Yeah, and this changed pretty significantly when Cade Cunningham made All-NBA, because that added about $8 million more onto the cap sheet than the Pistons were. I don't want to say planning for, because I think they had that in mind, but definitely changed things quite a bit with that. And clearly they wouldn't change any of that. They're happy. He made All-NBA. He's now being paid very fairly going forward. He's, the face of the franchise, all that good stuff. So now what you're really down to is, I think most people agree, Pistons' number one priority is re-signing Malik Beasley. Here's the good news. There's one team with meaningful cap space this summer, and that's the Brooklyn Nets, and they're probably not in the market for Malik. Make a lot of sense for them because he's a building team, nor would it make sense for Beasley himself to go to the Nets. So I think what we're looking at here for the Pistons is $16 million, because that's about what they can create in cap space. Is that enough for Beasley? Or is $14 million out of the non-tax MLE, is that enough for him? And how we get to those numbers is the $16 million, that's the max they can create in cap space. It's a little bit more than that, but that's in the range. And the way they do that is you wipe the books clear of all your free agents, you re-sign Beasley with your cap space, and off we go. That's where we're at. So that's option one. You would also then have the mid-level exception of about $8.8 million, the room exception of about $8.8 million that you could use at that point. So, all right, so we're in a spot where not a bad option, right? Your next decision is, could you stay over the cap, use the $14 million non-tax MLE to re-sign Malik Beasley with that number? You would then also have the $5 million biannual exception available to you. And that would allow you, if you stay over the cap, to keep your whatever versions of bird rights you have for Dennis Schroeder, Tim Hardaway Jr., Paul Reid, whoever it is on the roster. So you're not wiping those clear. The reason that matters is if you wipe them clear, you're down to, you have no mechanism to re-sign them beyond exceptions. If you want to re-sign those guys. So really your choices, if I make it super simple, are $16 million in cap space in the $8 million room exception, or $14 million non-tax MLE plus bird rights for your key free agents.
And just to give some listeners some even more with that, so the free agency, if the Pistons were to create $16 million of cap space, there, according to the people the Pistons might be interested in, they're probably not getting any of these free agents at the top of the free agent market with $16 million. That's not like with the Nas Reid, or you're not getting one of those guys with that much money. So what's the point of wiping out your cap holds to try to create that space if you can't really do anything with it? Is there any positive? I feel like I saw you spoke on the Pistons, Paul, so I've seen a bunch of people talk about this. And from my perspective, it seems like it's obvious that the Pistons should operate as an over the cap team. Is there any positive? Is there any reason you could see the Pistons say, you know what, that's actually not what we want to do. There's another reason why we want to go and try to wipe the books clean and operate as under the cap team?
Yeah, the reasons to go under the cap is it opens up a little more spending power in terms of the biannual exception. So weird, it rarely gets used anyway. So let's take that out of the mix. So really, what you'd be talking about is $16 million in cap space. That's more than the MLE, and then you'd have the room exception, which is then more than the biannual exception anyway. So you'd have a little bit more spending power that way if you're Detroit. And let's say Malik Beasley is like, actually, I'm going to move on to Team X anyway. It doesn't really matter. I'm headed there. Now, all of a sudden, you're in a spot where it's like, okay, well, at least we could use that to go get somebody. And that could either be through trade or anything. It's important to know, too, because this comes up as a major question. You can't combine them. You can't combine the cap space and the $8 million and say, hey, that's $24 million. Go get one guy for $24 million. You can't do that. But what you can do is you can take the $16 million in cap space plus a $8 million salary and go get $24 million player that way. You can combine cap space and outgoing salary. So you could still kind of get to where you want to be. So it really is kind of depends. And why it's so dependent on Malik Beasley is the Pistons only have non-bird rights. It was awesome for them all of last season to have Malik Beasley for $6 million. That's fantastic. He way outplayed that contract. He was terrific. And that was awesome right up until now, when we can't re-sign him using his non-bird rights, because I think he's well in position to demand more than, I think it's $7.2 million is what they could give him. He could probably nearly double that in free agency, because I do think there are teams that would say, yeah, we'll give you the MLE. We'll bring you in on that, because bench shooter scorer like that, it's huge. So then your other option, though, if you go the cap space route, is now what you have to factor in is, are we trying to keep Beasley? Great, we re-signed him. Where are we at with Schroeder, Hardaway Jr., Reid, a couple other guys? Reid, probably a minimum guy anyway. You're probably fine. Hardaway Jr., I know a lot of people are like, well, he's not worth the contract he was on anyway. This dude still started like 75 games or whatever it was last year, and was a big part of the team having the best season they've had in years. So that's easy to say he's not worth that, but he's still worth something. And then Dennis Schroeder is really good too. And you're probably at that point, only one of them is going to take the room exception. So now you're kind of down to, man, we're going to lose somebody in this game if we go the cap space route. Whereas if you stay over the cap, or again, you use the MLE on Beasley, you re-sign Schroeder and Hardaway using their bird rights, and you're in pretty good shape that way. That's why I think that's the more beneficial path. But it really comes down to, does Beasley need $2 million extra or not? If he doesn't, awesome. Where we stay over the cap and we go. And that's where I think those conversations will all be grown-ups. We're not going to scream and yell about tampering here. Those conversations have already been had, and I think they have a pretty good idea where they're headed.
And then there's another question I have about, you brought him up, Tim Hardaway Jr. There's been some situations that have been floated out to me. One of the Pistons community's own, who's been really into the cap and really into the CBA, Kyle Metz, he brought this situation up
Kyle's
to us.
The best, man. He's good. He's on our show all the time asking really good cap stuff.
Yeah, he's been floating a lot of situations out to me. So I want to ask you about something specifically around potentially trading THJ this offseason. We'll talk about that coming up. Today's episode is brought to you by BetterHelp. Let's talk about something that doesn't get talked about enough: men's mental health. There's pressure to always keep things together, to perform, provide, and never show weakness. But the truth is, real strength comes from opening up and taking care of your mental well-being. Every year, 6 million men in the U.S. experience depression, and many go undiagnosed. but talking to someone, a friend, a loved one, a therapist can make a huge difference. Therapy isn't just for crisis moments. It's a great way for learning how to set boundaries, build healthy coping tools, and be the best version of yourself. As the largest online therapy provider in the world, BetterHelp can provide access to mental health professionals with a diverse variety of expertise. Talk it out with BetterHelp. Our listeners get 10% off their first month at BetterHelp.com/LockedOnNBA. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOnNBA to get 10% off their first month with BetterHelp. So I want to thank you guys again for making Locked On Pistons your first listen of every single day. We are free to available on all your podcast platforms. If you haven't already, head to the YouTube channel at Locked On Pistons. Hit that subscribe button or leave us a 5-star review on whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on. That's another great way to support the podcast. And like I said before, head down to the description down below for the Substack for the playback. I have a Jane Ivey season review coming this week, hopefully, on the Substack, so stay tuned for that. But Keith, what I wanted to ask you next was, and we have a ton of questions coming up. We got a few questions from you guys over in the community to ask Keith, and we'll get those questions before we end the podcast. But where I wanted to go to next was Kyle, as we've mentioned before, has said to me numerous times that the Pistons, there's this rule, there's this way, this little maneuver the Pistons can do where they could use, I think they could re-sign THJ and potentially trade him the day after or immediately after. Is that something they can do? Can you explain what that maneuver technically is?
Yeah, generally people think about sign-in trades as like player X wants to get to a team and the team doesn't have cap space, so they're going to do a sign-in trade to get there. You can also do a sign-in trade where it's you sign and trade a player away. Now, here's the thing. Clearly, and I always say this, sign-in trades are a two-way street. It has to work for Tim Hardaway Jr. because you're not going to sign him and then immediately be like, off to Charlotte you go. See you later, pal. Like, that's not going to be a thing because he's going to have to agree to that. And it also has to work for the team. Let's say he was like, man, I really want to play for, I don't know, Atlanta again. And he's like, I really want to go back there. Well, if there's not a trade that works for the Pistons, they don't do it. Sign and trade's two-way street. That's why it's sign and trade. Now, you can't sign him and then turn around and trade him like a day later. There is a hold on that, on trading players. So it would be really one part of one transaction. But that's another benefit to staying over the cap. Because if you go under the cap and you wipe it clean, your ability to sign and trade Hardaway Jr., very, very limited. Now, you could make it work in a way where you kind of line things up where it's all right, we're going to go under the cap, but Beasley's only going to take, X amount of it, but you still have to have the amount, whatever you're sending out to re-sign Hardaway Jr. And that just makes it really difficult with that. So what they would ultimately end up doing, it would be something along the lines of, we're going to bring him, we're going to stay over the cap, and then we're going to, I'm just pulling a number out of the air, but $10 million a year salary. We're going to sign him to that. We're going to, ship him off to go get this other team. Because for the acquiring team, let's say they were like, man, we're not super into Hardaway Jr., but Detroit's giving us a first-round pick to get player X. So they really want, okay, that works for us, and Hardaway Jr. is the way to get that first. You only have to be guaranteed in the first year of a sign and trade. Has to be a 3-year deal, but years 2 and 3 can be completely non-guaranteed. We see those kind of pretty regularly. You could do it in a much bigger trade too. Let's say they wanted to mess around and get involved in Kevin Durant or something like that. You could sign him to a really big number, knowing the last 2 years are going to be non-guaranteed, ship him off with Tobias Harris. I'm just pulling names out, but put them together, go get KD, and that's how you make it work. That would be possible as well if that's the direction they wanted to go with that. But again, it has to be a partnership. Really, it becomes a 3-way partnership in that situation because it's the Pistons, it's Hardaway Jr., and it's the acquiring team. It has to be on board.
With that, so is that because they have his bird rights? Is that so?
Yeah.
So would it also play out then for Dennis? If they wanted to do the same thing with Schroeder, could they do it with him as well, as long as they stayed over the cap?
Yeah, yep. As long as you stay over the cap. Now with Schroeder, it's a little different, I think, and I'm going to double check this. I think they only have early bird rights on Dennis Schroeder. They may have full bird. I need to double check that. I should have had this prepared. My bad. Yeah, there's only early bird rights on Schroeder, but still probably more than enough to give him the bump in pay that he would need to be able to go sign him. I don't think it's going to be I don't think Dennis Schroeder's getting $30 million a year in a sign and trade, but if he gets 15 to 18, that should be more than enough to make that happen.
So that sounds incredibly interesting, and like I said, it's been something that's been floated around the community quite a few times. But the way you described it, and it's a lot of the same ways that in restricted free agency, we don't see a lot of sign and trades anymore either, because like you mentioned, it's not just one team, hey, do this, and that's what's happening. You have to get one team to agree, the player, and then the other team to agree to all of it. So despite that being incredibly interesting, would I be fair to say it's something that would be very hard to happen and probably unlikely for the Pistons to be able to get to do? Or is it not as hard as maybe I'm thinking it is?
I don't think it's quite as hard. What makes it a little bit more difficult now under the current CBA, it was always this way, but it's now the apron issues are just so much more prevalent because every team, like we ended up with, out of the 30 NBA teams this past season, we ended up with, let me make sure I get it right, 24 teams, including the Pistons, were hard capped at either the first or second apron. Now, like Detroit was hard capped at the second apron and were 9 million miles away from it, so it didn't matter. It had never came into play. But for a lot of those teams, it was a factor, and it did make it more difficult. So it can be a little trickier to pull it off. From the Detroit side, it's pretty easy because there's nothing that's really going to keep them from doing a move like that, but it is a little trickier. Now, the good news for the Pistons too is almost no matter what path they take, they're miles away from even the luxury tax line, never mind the aprons. So you're just in a spot where they've got all this flexibility where they can do a lot of different stuff. They can take on money in trades. They can do things that are just play out a little bit differently than they will for other teams. So I didn't really answer your question because it's not a clean answer. It's a little more tricky, but it could happen. It wouldn't shock me if that's the way it played out.
All right. So the next question I have, I wanted to make sure I pulled up. I should have had this earlier up, but I wanted to make sure I had the Pistons salary cap sheet in front of me. All right. So the Pistons, obviously, we talked about playing potentially operating as an over the cap team, under the cap team, whatever. My question now is, so we've seen the Pistons in the last week be linked to potentially being interested in Reid, potentially being interested in Myles Turner, a few players, and obviously the Pistons, they'd like to improve their squad this offseason. My question is, so how exactly can the Pistons get? Is it possible for them to get any other players this offseason in free agency if they operate as over the cap team? So is their only way of acquiring players is by using the non-taxpayer MLE, and then the 5 point whatever exception? Is that the only way they can acquire anybody in free agency?
Anyone of note, like any of the names you threw out there, Reid, Turner, if it's anybody else outside of trades, right? Obviously trades can be a thing that can happen, but other than that, you're really you're stuck to using your signing exceptions. And again, if they stay over the cap, you're probably using the non-tax MLE, I assume, to bring back Beasley. And if you do that, then you're in a position where, okay, we're bringing back Beasley. That's great. We feel really good about that. But then after that, it turns into, all right, where are we going from there? And then that is, all right, well, we're going to re-sign Schroeder. We're going to re-sign Hardaway or use him in a sign and trade. It's really that $5 million, but that's not going to be enough for Reid or Turner or, any of those major free agents. You wouldn't be in play on those guys. Quite frankly, I don't know if you'll be in play with $16 million in cap space or even the $14 million non-tax if Beasley's to walk. So I don't want to, I'm not here to be a wet blanket, but I'd like to be realistic with talking through these things. Now, Reid, maybe you could get involved in some form of sign and trade type thing where they acquire him via sign and trade. That could be a thing. If the Timberwolves are like, hey, man, we're just way too expensive. We can't be paying a backup big man the $20 million a year that he wants. He opts out. Pistons have plenty of clearance that they could do something like that where they could work a trade to bring in a guy like Reid. And that would be how you go about acquiring a guy like that. I don't know how much the Pacers are going to want to be, let's trade our starting center off a finals team and a sign and trade to a direct division rival. I think that's more likely to be like, nah, good luck. Go dream somewhere else. But I think Reid could still be a target even if they stay over the cap. Again, this is because the Pistons have so much flexibility underneath those aprons.
So because they have flexibility underneath the aprons, my next question would be: can the Pistons make a trade where they're absorbing cap space, or does the cap space have to be similar in whatever trade they make, like the matching salaries?
Yeah, so two things here. Let's talk because it's really two different things. If you're using cap space in a trade, you can just take a guy right into cap space. And that would be, again, you cleared the decks, but at that point, you've probably lost Beasley. So now, if we're using 16 million, and I know Pistons fans are familiar with that one of let's use cap space to eat some contracts. They've done that for several years over the last decade. So that becomes a very easy thing. If you're over the cap, the matching salary in a trade, it's still pretty flexible. It really is a pretty big chunk. Now, if you take back more than an equal amount to what you send out, so let's say they're just keeping the numbers round, but they send out 20 million. If they take back 25 million in a trade, which would be legal, they would be able to do that. You would be in a spot where you become hard capped at the first apron. But again, they are, and conservatively, the Pistons, and this is without re-signing Beasley or anybody like that, I've got them, they're 52 million under the tax line. They're about 60 or about 60.7 million under the first apron. So even if you are going the cap space route, you're re-signing Beasley for 16 million, you still have, 44 million in play before you'd even be running into a hard cap. And that's pretty good to, flexibility there. And in that world, you may be having to replace one of Hardaway or Schroeder if the room exception isn't enough for them. But again, that's even if you use cap space plus that's 24 million out of 60 million, you still have 36 million in play. And that's more than enough wiggle room in a trade to bring back salary on your side.
Yeah, so I asked this because it seems like the Pistons' best chance to improve and get better and upgrade the roster is going to be in the trade market. And a lot of times when you see these fake trades involving the Pistons, it seems like that because they don't have very many big contracts. A lot of these guys are still on rookie contracts. It's really just Cade, Isaiah Stewart, and Tobias. So it seems like, okay, if the Pistons do try to make a trade to upgrade, will it have to then include Tobias or Stu in order for salary implications? Do you assume that would have to be the case?
Probably at least one of the two, just for the salary matching purposes. Again, I'm using KD as an example because we know he's available and he makes 50 plus million. In order to get there, if Detroit's over the cap, you still got to get to like 40 million to even be in range of trading for him. So once you got to get to 40 million salary, well, all of a sudden, all right, that sounds great, but they don't have 40 million in one player to just send out. So that's where you start talking like, all right, that one wouldn't work on a Hardaway Jr. sign and trade because the Suns would very likely still be over the second apron and they wouldn't be able to accept a player in a sign and trade. You can if you're already over the first apron too, because that triggers that hard cap at the first apron. But that would put you in a spot where you can't really do that. But yeah, I mean, then you're talking about, all right, well, it's going to be Harris and Stewart, and we're loading up that way, and that's the way we're going to go after it if it's a number that big. If it's a guy who's making, even Naz Reid, where they're acquiring him in a sign and trade, and his first year salary is 20 to 25 million, you could get there with Stewart and like one other guy fairly easily.
All right, fair enough. We'll see what happens. My next question, which we'll tackle when we come back, is, does it make sense under this new CBA, after what I just asked you, is it important to maybe get some of these young guys like a Jaden Ivey or a Jalen Duren, even if you don't think that maybe they're worth the contract? Is it beneficial to the Pistons to sign them to an extension so they have some other larger salaries to at least use in trade? We'll talk about that coming up. Today's episode is brought to you by OpenPhone. If you're running a business, you know that every missed call is money left on the table. Think about the last time you had an urgent need, maybe for a plumber or a service provider. If the first person didn't answer, did you wait? Probably not. You moved on, and that's why you need OpenPhone. OpenPhone is the #1 business phone system built to streamline and scale your customer communications, all from an app on your phone or computer. OpenPhone lets me manage business calls and texts from a single app, and their AI agent handles after-call hours, answers common questions, and captures leads so you never miss a customer. OpenPhone is offering my listeners 20% off their first 6 months at openphone.com/LockedOnNBA. That's OpenPhone.com/LockedOnNBA. NBA. And if you have existing numbers with another service, OpenPhone will port them over at no extra charge. Again, that's openphone.com/LockedOnNBA. OpenPhone, no missed calls, no missed customers with OpenPhone. So I want to thank you guys again for making Locked On Pistons your first listen of every single day. We're free and available on all your podcast platforms. If you haven't already, head to the YouTube channel at Locked On Pistons. Hit that subscribe button or leave us a 5-star review on whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on. There's another great way to support the podcast. All right, Keith, I want to get this question in, and then we can answer some of the questions the community sent in. So this upcoming offseason, the Pistons have some decisions to make with Jalen Duren and Jaden Ivey. They're both contract extension eligible. And there's been a lot of discussion about whether these guys are worth an extension. Should you sign them to an extension? Would you give them 20, 25, 27? Like, what would you give them? I mean, one of the points that I've seen some people bring up, which I think is a fair one, is even if you don't think, let's just throw out Jaden Ivey, or it doesn't really matter which one. Let's say you don't think that they're worth $25 million, but you sign them to a $25 million extension because you feel like you need some higher salaries on your roster to then make trades that you can match salaries with. Is that a smart plan to go about under this new CBA? Or from your perspective, would you be a little careful about that?
You have to be careful because there's a pretty fine line between tradable salary and then it turns into bad salary. And when you're on the side of bad salary, that's when it's like, now we have to pay to get off it. I don't, unless you started talking max deals for either Ivey or Duren, I don't know that they're going to trip into bad salary range for the Pistons. I think there's, I've learned over the last several months. I think I'm higher on Jalen Duren than a lot of Pistons fans even are, which is pretty rare for me. I don't usually come into a team podcast and then find out like I rate a player higher than the fan base does. Normally it's quite frankly very far the other direction. But I think with Duren, I think you're in a spot where he's really good and he's a really good pick and roll partner for Cade Cunningham. Like they are just a really good match. I think he made real steps forward defensively. I know a lot of people argue with me about that one and don't think that's true. I think he's a really solid rebounding player now too. And I think what really excited me is you saw him make passes this year that we've never really seen him make passing reads. And to me, that's a guy you re-sign. Centers are kind of swinging back a little bit more into, if you want to win at the highest level, you better have a competent one there. So that's where I think you re-sign him. I love Jaden Ivey, but we're kind of coming off what turned into a lost season a little bit with the injury. So now you're kind of, all right, it's not that we're starting over. We have a good book on what he can be. And then your other question is, all right, do we think he can be a starter? Do we think he can start alongside Cade Cunningham in the backcourt, or is a world where there's another guard and Cunningham gets bumped up to kind of be a playmaking wing and now we start two guards? If Ivey's a starter and the Pistons are convinced of that, that sets his price at one level. If he's a really good third combo guard, which is not an insult, that's a great role. We've seen a lot of guys excel in that role for a number of years. That sets the price at another number, but it's a little lower. And that's the discussion the Pistons need to be having both internally and how is he viewed externally? Because the old saying is it only takes one, keep it clean for the show, to kind of ruin your plans by throwing out a major offer sheet in restricted free agency. And if there's a team next summer, meaning the summer of 2026, when there should be a lot more cap space available, that's like, you know what? We like Jaden Ivey as a $35 million a year player. Now, all of a sudden, they throw an off sheet and the Pistons like, man, we didn't want to let him go, but that's a little bit bigger and that's going to cause us issues down the line. So very long answer to your very simple question of you have to be very careful, but I do think being proactive with signing players is generally a pretty good thing, because when you start messing around with, hey, go see what's out there in restricted free agency, one, maybe that damages your relationship with the player. And if the player is good enough, it can end up costing you a lot more money than what you were thinking.
And my next question is, real quickly, before we get into the community questions, if the Pistons were to wait until the trade deadline, if they were to not extend these guys and they wait till the trade deadline, one, is it possible to, if they extend someone this offseason, is it possible to trade them at the deadline? Or do they have to wait longer? And then two, would it make more sense, in your opinion, looking at some salary cap situation for the Pistons, if they wanted to make a decision on either player involving trades at the deadline? Is it better to have them on an extended contract, or is it better to have them entering in restricted free agency where they're trading this player to another team? And now that team, while they don't have a long-term contract, they do still have the right to whatever happens in restricted free agency will just match the contract.
Yeah, and it's a really good question. And I'm going to use Jalen Green of the Rockets as an example here, because there was a lot of talk of, well, that contract made him a tradable player without the Rockets fully locking in kind of, I'll say forever, but, for the length of the deal at a max deal or anything like that. But here's the challenge. In the CBA, there's a thing called the poison pill. Well, it's really not called that in the CBA, but that's what we all call it, which is the poison pill, which means if you extend a player, let's use Jalen Green as example, because this is a real life example with him. He's being paid $12.5 million this year on the last year of his rookie scale deal. His salary on his extension is $33 million, $36 million, then a $36 million player option. So on the Rocket side, his outgoing salary, he counts he would count at the number that the number he is right now, which is at $12.5 million. But for the incoming team, he counts at the average of all those years. That's the poison pill component, and that's like $29 million. So that imbalance makes things really hard to find a workable trade in season, because it's hard to find a team that can take in $17 million more than what the Rockets can take back. That's where it kind of becomes that challenge point. So that's why you don't see those guys often get extended then traded. And that's kind of the idea, right? The idea is if you're extending a guy, extend them because you want them, right? Like extend them because you want them on your team. Like just, don't extend them to just make them a tradable contract down the line. Like that's kind of what this is put in there, to not block, but just make it a lot harder.
All right, fair enough. All right, let's get into some of the questions that some people asked us, sent in over on Twitter when I let everyone know that we were having you on the podcast. One of the questions is, I think you already answered this, to be honest. This one's from Jamar. It says, can the Pistons afford to sign either Naz Reid or Myles Turner? Does it have to be a sign-and trade? I believe you've already said that it would have to be a sign-and trade.
Yeah.
All right, let's move on to Big Dog Pistons. It says, he says, what do you guess the numbers on these players' contracts would look like? Naz Reid, Nickeil Alexander, and Caris LeVert.
Yeah, Naz Reid, I think if he opts out, I think you're looking at something in the range of probably $18 to $20 million average annual value on him. So a little bit out of the Pistons price range as a straight signing there. Nickeil Alexander-Walker, I think with how good he was in the playoffs and how he's really stabilized as a pretty good shooter now, which is a pretty big surprise because he was an awful shooter early in his career. And now we've got enough years in a row of good shooting that I think we can call him a good shooter. Plus, he's a really good defender. He did it on the highest levels in the playoffs last 2 years. I think he's probably an MLE type guy. So we're talking 14, probably like 15 million annual for him. Probably like 4 years, 60 million. LeVert's a little bit different because Caris LeVert is a good player. But yeah, he's not a great defender. He's not a great shooter. But what he really is like another big on-ball playmaker. And if you're bringing him in like, hey, we're going to put him in our rotation as the third guard off the bench, who can also play really anywhere 1 through 3, that has value. So, and again, probably MLE-ish range for him. Maybe a touch less.
All right, next question is from Joyful on Twitter. It said, how do teams stay together under this new CBA, particularly a team like the Pistons with multiple young pieces all coming off rookie contracts so shortly?
Yeah, it's harder than it was before. The way the CBA has been put together, they basically said, if you want to draft and develop and then re-sign and extend all of your own players, you can do that. It's just going to get really expensive, and we're going to put a bunch of roster building restrictions on top of you. What it was basically designed to combat. Remember a couple years ago, the Warriors were like the Warriors again, and then they went out and signed Dante DiVincenzo. It was like, how? Like, how is this a thing? Well, it's because there was nothing to really restrict what you could do then, because as long as you had the exceptions, which they used the taxpayer MLE to re-sign them, you could do that. Now it's, if you're a second apron team and you're super expensive, you're down to signing your own draft picks, re-signing your own free agents, and then signing guys to minimum deals. That's really all you can do to add talent as long as you're over the second apron. So that becomes a little bit harder to work through. So that's where you can do it, but it does make it a little harder. You have to, if you're going to put together a team that's going to be around with a pretty good window, you have to be very careful on just throwing out max deals. Like the Pistons, for example, you already have Cade on a max deal. I don't know that you could go there, and you probably don't need to for like Duren and Ivey. You don't want to have more than a couple guys on a max deal. Then the next guys on reasonable contracts, and then it's going to cost you some of your depth pieces. You're going to have to cycle through those guys a little bit, and it's really important. You got to keep hitting on the draft, because if you keep nailing your draft picks, well, that's just cost control, reasonable salary that you'll have for quite a while.
All right, and then this is a question I have, and I asked you this last time you were on, but now the Pistons actually had a good season, and now it maybe changes some things. But this is a question I have. Entering this offseason, obviously, Cade Cunningham it's not super. Is it a super max? Is that what it's considered now that he hit All-NBA? Or
yeah, I mean, those terms are kind of made up terms that we all use, myself included. I think of the super max as the full 35%. So he's on a 30% max. So he's like in the middle.
Okay, so he's on that contract now because he hit All-NBA, and you already talked about how that has made it a little bit harder on the Pistons. It's a good problem to have, but it's it's made it a little bit harder on the salary cap. And now you're entering into off seasons where you have to either decide on extending Duren and Ivey, and then the following off season you then have to make a decision on Ausar Thompson. My question is, and like I said, I asked you this last time you were on, but the Pistons hadn't had a good season yet, and Cade's whole little extension thing didn't happen yet. Is this from a cap point of view? Would you think that this is the offseason where the Pistons have to start making some decisions, maybe some tough decisions, maybe some is this the core we want? Because Cade's extension's kicking in. If we extend both these guys next year, we have a guy that we probably value a little bit more, and we're definitely going to extend. Now we're really locked into these four guys. Is this the offseason where you would expect, if the Pistons did want to make a move, this would be the offseason to do it? Or am I getting ahead of things a little too much? It's not as risky. It's not as, questioning what you have to do. You don't have to be as rash into making decisions right now with this core. Can you wait? Or do you think that this is the offseason where you kind of have to start making some decisions here?
No, it's a really fair question, because this is how quickly it happens in the NBA. Like Ausar Thompson just finished year 2, but he's only got one more year before when we do this a year from now, we'll be talking about his extension. Like, that's how quickly this comes together in the NBA. You really finish the second year, and then you're starting to have to talk about it, because, like, man, we got one more year before we got to extend this guy. The good news is, because of restricted free agency is so heavily weighted towards the incumbent team that you can play a little bit more, unless you've got teams that are going to get crazy with offer sheets. Brooklyn did it, in the pre-Kyrie KD rebuild years. They threw around a bunch of offer sheets, which all turned into not great contracts in the end, even though then the Nets acquired some of them anyway after they were matched. But what you have to be cautious of is just don't overextend guys, meaning, like, if the Pistons said, great, we have Cade, now here's a max for Duren, and we're going to go $35 million a year for Ivey. Now all of a sudden it's like, all right, you went a little too far. You got maybe a little too excited for your guys. If you keep it a little more reasonable with them in extensions, and if it comes down to, all right, if we're not quite there, let's see what it looks like in the summer. Not that you have to say, go get an offer sheet and we'll match it, but it's, all right, we have one more year of data. We know what it looks like. Now we can re-sign you guys there, because that's another key component of this. Tough decisions on the young core, no. I think where you have to make some tough decisions on is the older core guys. Like, they're going to re-sign Beasley, whether it's in cap space or it's using the exception. You have to be really certain that he's going to hold up and be worth that for at least most of that next contract. If he is, great. Move on, sign him and go. Whatever you give Schroeder. If you do something with Hardaway Jr., you can't be, hey, good vibes summer, we're staying over the cap, and Hardaway Jr. is getting $15 million a year for the next 4 years. That's probably not going to be a good contract. It's probably going to end up being kind of wasted money down the line. You just have to be careful, I guess is the way I need to put that.
All right, fair enough. And there was another question from, but I felt like this is a tough question to ask, but I'll ask it anyways in case you have any answer to it. I don't expect you to have a crazy answer because I feel like it's an unfair question. But this is if you were Tom Gores, what would you do with this team this offseason?
Yeah, I'd try to run it back to some extent. I'd try to get Beasley back in the fold just because I think he's such a great fit. I would stay over the cap, and hopefully that's enough for him to return. Then re-sign Schroeder. I'd even consider re-signing Hardaway Jr. if the deal's reasonable enough. See what's out there and trade. We talked about it. They don't have any monster expiring salaries to trade, but they do have some tradable salary in the form of Fontecchio and Isaiah Stewart. You could put them into a deal together for, that's 23 million or so in salary you could put into a deal. And I think that would be enough to go get you somebody good. And Fontecchio by the end of the year wasn't a rotation guy. Stewart, you'd have to be careful that you don't leave yourself too shorthanded up front, which is kind of odd, right? Because we went for a year where it was like, hey, this team has 97 centers under contract, and now it's like talking about it. Are they going to be too shorthanded? Like, you just need to be careful with that. But there's always centers kicking around for the minimum that you can get somebody to come. I mean, look at Thomas Bryant and Tony Bradley are playing key roles for the Pacers rather in the finals. So there's always guys like that you can go get. So I would probably mostly run it back with the idea of, hey, if the right upgrades are there for us to make through trade, let's do that. And I would try to hammer out reasonable extensions with both Duren and Ivey and just not let that be a thing that hangs over us any longer than it has to.
All right, that's all we've got for you today. Thank you, Keith, for coming on, man. We always appreciate you coming on. You always provide so much detail and info for all of us. You guys can find him over on Twitter at Keith Smith NBA. I want to thank you guys for making Locked On Pistons your first listen of every single day. Free and available on all your podcast platforms. Hit that subscribe button at the YouTube channel. Leave us a 5-star review, whatever podcast platform you're listening to this on. And until next time, I'll see you guys later. Stay safe out there. And until next time, peace out, everybody.